My name is Madison Hale, and I am 34 years old. When I first met his family, I remember thinking I had stepped into a life most people only see in movies. Their home was warm and spotless, filled with soft laughter and framed photographs that told a story of unity, tradition, and success. They welcomed me with open arms, compliments that flowed easily, and smiles so polished they almost felt rehearsed. I told myself I was lucky. After years of watching other people struggle with in-laws who disapproved or interfered, I believed I had somehow avoided that fate. I thought I was walking into a dream. They called themselves close. Not just close unbreakable. They finished each other's sentences, shared inside jokes I didn't understand, and spoke about family loyalty as if it were sacred law. At first, I found it beautiful. I admired how involved they were in each other's lives. How his mother knew every detail of his routine. How his father spoke about legacy with pride in his voice. I mistook intensity for love. Looking back, I realized the first warning wasn't what they said. It was what they didn't. There was a strange stillness beneath their warmth, like I was being studied instead of welcomed. His mother's hugs lingered just a second too long. His sister's compliments felt sharp around the edges, as if they were testing how I reacted to praise. They asked questions about my upbringing, my career, my family not casually, but carefully. And every answer I gave seemed to be measured against something invisible. I told myself I was imagining it. I didn't want to be the paranoid fiancé looking for problems where none existed. After all, they were kind. They brought me gifts. They insisted I call them family. They told me how excited they were for the wedding. But sometimes kindness can feel like a performance. The first real crack appeared during a dinner where wedding plans were being discussed. What started as suggestions quickly became decisions. The venue, the guest list, the traditions they insisted on honoring. Every time I gently tried to express what I wanted, the room went quiet for half a second too long. Then someone would laugh lightly, as if I had said something naive. His mother would say things like, "In our family, we've always done it this way." His father would nod, adding, "It's important to preserve what matters." The message was subtle but clear. I wasn't just marrying him. I was entering their structure. And structures don't bend easily. What unsettled me most wasn't their control. It was how naturally my fiancé slipped back into their rhythm. Around them, he changed slightly. He became quieter, more agreeable. He would squeeze my hand under the table, a silent reassurance. But he rarely contradicted them openly. I told myself it was respect. I told myself families just had dynamics you had to adjust to. Still, something inside me tightened. There were moments I caught his mother watching me when she thought I wasn't looking. Her expression wasn't cruel. It was calculating. As if she was trying to determine whether I fit into a space that had already been designed without me in mind. I began to feel like I wasn't being welcomed into a family, I was being evaluated for admission. The closer the wedding date came, the more intense their involvement became. They wanted access to everything. The seating chart, the vows, even the guest list from my side of the family. They framed it as support, as wanting to help ease my stress. But instead of feeling supported, I felt observed. One evening, after leaving their house, I finally admitted something to myself I had been pushing away for weeks. Their smiles didn't comfort me. They unsettled me. It wasn't dramatic. There were no obvious red flags, no screaming arguments, no blatant disrespect. Just a steady, quiet pressure that made me feel smaller each time I was around them. As if the version of me they approved of was slightly different from who I actually was. I tried to talk to my fiancé about it. Carefully. I told him I sometimes felt overwhelmed, like decisions were being made too quickly. He listened, but there was hesitation in his eyes. He reminded me that his family meant well, that they were protective because they cared deeply. That once the wedding was over, things would settle. I wanted to believe him. I told myself nerves were normal before a wedding. That fear of change can disguise itself as suspicion. I didn't want to be the reason tension formed between him and his parents. I didn't want to start our marriage with conflict, so I ignored the warning signs. I ignored the way his mother subtly corrected me when I spoke about our future. The way his sister asked oddly specific questions about my finances. The way his father emphasized how important it was that family matters stay within the family. Each moment was small, insignificant on its own. But together, they formed a pattern I didn't fully understand yet. I thought I was marrying into security, tradition, stability. Instead, I was slowly stepping into something that felt rehearsed, controlled, and too polished to be real. And as the wedding day crept closer, that quiet, persistent feeling grew louder. Their smiles were flawless, but they felt like a warning I didn't know how to interpret yet. Each moment on its own seemed harmless. A door that was always locked when I visited. A conversation that stopped the second I entered the room. A look exchanged between his parents that felt less like love and more like silent coordination. Once, while helping in the kitchen, I heard his mother whisper sharply, "She doesn't need to know that yet." When I walked in, the subject changed instantly. Smiles returned. Laughter resumed. But the air had shifted. It felt staged. I tried to convince myself it was wedding stress. Families get tense before big events. Secrets can be harmless surprises. But this didn't feel harmless. It felt controlled. The closer we got to the wedding date, the more urgent their perfection became. Every detail had to look flawless. Every narrative had to stay intact. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about containment. And then one night, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His father's office door, always closed, was slightly open. Papers were spread across the desk. My name was on one of them. Not in celebration. In documentation. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a future daughter-in-law and started feeling like an outsider standing too close to something I wasn't supposed to see. I thought I was marrying into stability. I didn't realize I was walking toward a secret so dangerous they were willing to smile through it. Right up until I said, "I do." And I had no idea that I was about to find it before the wedding day arrived. At first, their involvement felt flattering. They insisted on paying for things we hadn't asked them to. They offered connections, upgrades, better options. They said they only wanted the wedding to reflect family tradition, family values, family reputation. Every suggestion came wrapped in generosity, and every decision came with a smile. But slowly, I began to notice something terrifying. None of the decisions were actually ours. The guest list shifted without my knowledge. Names were added important business partners, distant relatives I had never met. Meanwhile, some of my friends were quietly removed because the venue was reaching capacity. When I questioned it, his mother gently placed her hand on mine and said, "Trust us. We know how these events should look." Should look. That word stuck with me. It wasn't about celebration, it was about presentation. The florist changed. The menu changed. Even the wording in our wedding program was rewritten to better reflect family legacy. I started to feel like a prop in someone else's production. When I tried to push back, even softly, the room would fall silent in that same unsettling way. Then someone would redirect the conversation, as if my input had simply been a misunderstanding. What hurt most wasn't their control. It was my fiancé qui compliance. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. He just adapted. Around them, he became the son they expected. He would reassure me in private, promising we'd adjust things later. That once we were married, boundaries would be easier to establish. But every time we returned to their house, it was like watching him step back into a role he had never truly left. I started noticing patterns. When I entered a room unexpectedly, conversations would stop. Not dramatically, just subtly. A half-finished sentence. A quick glance between his parents. A topic change that felt too smooth to be natural. Once, while helping set up for a family gathering, I overheard his sister say, "She still doesn't know?" There was a sharp hush after that. When I walked in, they were laughing about something completely unrelated. They acted like I hadn't heard anything. But I had. The unease inside me began to grow into something heavier. It wasn't jealousy. It wasn't insecurity. It was isolation. I realized I was the only person in the room who didn't fully understand what was happening. They shared looks I couldn't decode. They referenced things I hadn't been told. It felt less like joining a family and more like being observed from outside a locked door. And then the financial conversations began. His father insisted on handling vendor contracts to make sure everything was done properly. He asked for copies of my identification for logistical reasons. He casually mentioned merging certain arrangements after the wedding, joint investments, shared assets, structural decisions that sounded bigger than a celebration. When I asked for clarity, I was met with warmth that felt rehearsed. "You worry too much," his mother would say gently. "We're protecting you." Protecting me from what? That question kept me awake at night. The closer we got to the wedding date, the tighter the control became. My access to certain documents was unnecessary. My concerns were reframed as stress. When I asked my fiancé directly if there was something I didn't know, he hesitated just for a second too long. And that hesitation broke something inside me. Because hesitation means awareness. I began to feel like the only person not in on a conversation that directly involved my life. Every time I entered their home, the air felt thicker, like the walls themselves were holding information I wasn't allowed to hear. Their smiles remained flawless, but now I could see the strain beneath them. Not fear of me, but fear of timing. They weren't worried about whether I would find out. They were worried about when. One evening, as we were leaving dinner, I noticed his father lock a drawer in his office with deliberate care. It was subtle. Most people wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Because earlier that night, when I had walked past that same desk, I had seen something with my name printed across the top. Not in cursive. In contract form. The realization didn't hit all at once. It unfolded slowly, painfully, like a truth my mind didn't want to accept. This wasn't about tradition. It wasn't about family closeness. It was about control. And I was the only one who didn't know the full plan. That night, lying awake beside the man I loved, I stared at the ceiling and felt something colder than doubt settle into my chest. If they were this coordinated before the wedding, what would happen after the vows? Because whatever they were hiding, it wasn't small. It required silence. It required unity. It required me to stay trusting long enough to walk down that aisle. And for the first time since saying yes to his proposal, I didn't feel excited about the wedding. I felt like I was running out of time. I didn't go looking for the secret. If I'm honest, part of me was still hoping there wasn't one. I wanted my unease to be nerves. I wanted the tension to be miscommunication. I wanted to marry the man I loved without uncovering something that would force me to choose between him and my instincts. But secrets don't always reveal themselves dramatically. Sometimes they wait for you to trip over them. It happened 3 weeks before the wedding. His parents had invited us over to finalize some last-minute details. My fiancé was helping his father outside with something in the garage, and I was told I could wait in the living room. The house was unusually quiet. Too quiet. His mother had stepped out to take a call, and for the first time since I'd been coming there, I was alone. I wasn't snooping. I was just looking for a pen. There was a folder on the side table, plain, unmarked. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't locked away. It was just there, as if it belonged in plain sight. I wouldn't have opened it if my name hadn't caught my eye. Not handwritten. Printed. In bold. My stomach dropped before my mind caught up. At first, I told myself it was probably wedding paperwork. Maybe vendor contracts. Maybe seating arrangements. But the moment I flipped it open, I knew this wasn't about flowers or catering. It was legal. Structured. Permanent. The document wasn't a wedding agreement. It was a prenuptial contract. But not the kind you discuss openly and negotiate together. This one had already been drafted. Already outlined. Already detailed in ways that made it clear it wasn't a precaution. It was protection. Not for both of us. For them, clauses about family assets, business shares, inheritance distribution, conditions that would activate if certain circumstances changed. And buried in the language, written carefully enough to sound neutral, was something that made my hands start to shake. If the marriage dissolved under behavioral instability or financial misrepresentation, I would walk away with nothing. Behavioral instability. I felt like the air had been pulled from my lungs. Suddenly, Every whisper, every look, every subtle comment about my stress levels, every insistence on handling financial matters themselves. It wasn't tradition. It was preparation. Preparation for a narrative. I flipped through the pages, my pulse pounding in my ears. There were references to financial disclosures I had never made, assumptions about my assets that weren't accurate, language that framed me as a potential liability, not a partner. And the worst part? My fiancé's name was already signed on the preliminary draft, dated weeks ago, before I had even sensed something was wrong. The room felt like it was spinning. I wanted to believe it was fake, a misunderstanding, a draft he hadn't agreed to. But signatures don't appear by accident. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The wedding wasn't just a celebration anymore. It was a deadline. They weren't trying to control the details for aesthetic reasons. They were trying to make sure everything was finalized before I discovered what I wasn't meant to see. And I had just seen it. I heard the garage door close and panic surged through me. I quickly slid the papers back into place, aligning them exactly as they had been. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the folder. I sat back down on the couch just as footsteps approached. When my fiancé walked in, he smiled at me. That same warm smile I had fallen in love with. And for the first time, I didn't know if it was real. I studied his face, searching for guilt, for hesitation, for something that would confirm he hadn't willingly signed something that positioned me as a threat. But he looked calm, normal, unaware that the illusion had cracked. His mother entered seconds later, her expression composed as always. Perfect posture, perfect tone, perfect family. I suddenly understood why they had been so careful. Why conversations stopped when I entered. Why finances were framed as complicated. Why his father insisted on handling documentation personally. They weren't hiding a small secret. They were building a safety net in case I ever stepped out of line. And if I hadn't found that folder by accident, I would have walked down the aisle blind. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling again, but this time, I wasn't confused. I was calculating. If I confronted him, would he deny it? Would he claim it was just a precaution? Would he admit his parents pressured him? Or worse, would he defend it? The wedding invitations had already been sent. Deposits were non-refundable. Family members were flying in from out of state. Everything was in motion. And now I knew the truth. The vows weren't just promises of love. They were the final step in locking me into an agreement I hadn't consented to. For weeks, I had felt like I was being evaluated. Now I understood why. I wasn't marrying into a perfect family. I was stepping into a controlled structure where trust was optional but leverage was mandatory. And the most terrifying part wasn't the contract. It was realizing I had to decide what to do before walking down that aisle. Because once I said, "I do," the trap would close. I didn't sleep the night after I found the contract. I lay beside the man I was supposed to marry, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, wondering how someone could sleep so peacefully while my entire reality was collapsing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my name printed in bold letters beneath clauses that treated me like a risk to be managed. Not a partner. Not a future wife. A liability. The wedding was 10 days away. 10 days from walking down an aisle toward a promise that suddenly felt conditional. I kept asking myself the same question. Did he know what this really meant? Or had he signed it because his parents told him it was just a formality? The more I replayed the past few months in my head, the more I realized how carefully everything had been orchestrated. The financial conversations framed as protection, the emphasis on family stability, the subtle comments about making sure intentions were pure. They hadn't been preparing for a wedding. They had been preparing for control. And now I had a choice. I could stay silent, pretend I never saw it, sign whatever they put in front of me, smile for the photos, exchange vows while knowing there was a version of me already drafted in legal language unstable, unreliable, replaceable. I could tell myself love would fix it later. That once we were married, I would have more influence, more leverage, more safety. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Silence wouldn't protect me. It would confirm their version of me. The version that didn't question, the version that complied, the version that could be reshaped to fit their structure. The alternative was terrifying. Expose it. Confront him. Confront them. Bring the contract into the open before the wedding day. Risk being labeled dramatic, suspicious, untrusting. Risk canceling everything. The deposits, the guests, the expectations, the humiliation. Burn it all down. I had spent my entire life avoiding scenes, avoiding conflict, avoiding being the reason something fell apart. The thought of standing up in the middle of carefully planned perfection and saying, "This isn't right," made my stomach twist. Not because I was wrong, but because I knew they would make me look like I was. For days, I watched him differently. I looked for signs, guilt, hesitation, something that would tell me he was trapped too. But he moved through wedding preparations calmly. He talked about honeymoon plans, about future investments, about moving closer to his parents' business to stay connected. Stay connected. The phrase sounded different now. I realized something slowly, painfully. Even if he hadn't written the contract, he had signed it. Even if he hadn't created the structure, he was willing to operate inside it. And marriage doesn't magically undo that kind of alignment. One evening, 3 days before the final vendor payments were due, I asked him directly. I didn't accuse. I didn't yell. I just placed the copy of the contract on the table between us and waited. The look on his face when he saw it told me everything. It wasn't shock. It was exposure. He tried to explain. He said it was standard, that his parents insisted, that it was meant to protect family assets, not hurt me. He said it didn't change how he felt, that it was just precaution. Precaution against what? Against me. The more he spoke, the more I understood the truth wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a priority. His loyalty wasn't divided. It was already decided. He believed in the structure. He believed his parents knew best. He believed that love could coexist with leverage. And that was the moment the decision stopped being about the wedding. It became about me. Could I marry into a family that saw me as a potential threat? Could I build a life inside a framework designed to contain me? Could I say vows about trust while knowing there were clauses prepared in case I failed to behave the way they expected? The answer didn't come loudly. It came quietly. I imagined myself 5 years from now, adjusting, compromising, justifying, slowly shrinking, so I wouldn't activate any of the language buried in that contract. Smiling at family gatherings while knowing my place had been legally defined before I ever stepped into it. That image hurt more than the idea of canceling the wedding. The night before invitations were set to be finalized, I made my choice. I told him I couldn't go through with it, not under these conditions, not without transparency, not without rewriting everything together, openly, equally. He called me impulsive. His mother called me ungrateful. His father called me emotional. But none of them denied the truth. The next 48 hours were chaos. Calls, accusations, damage control. They tried to reframe it as my fear of commitment, as pre-wedding anxiety, as misunderstanding. They tried to pressure me into postponing instead of canceling to keep the illusion intact. I refused. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't scream. I didn't expose them publicly. I simply stepped away. I withdrew my name from the paperwork. I contacted vendors. I informed guests that the wedding was off. And in doing so, I felt something unexpected. Not devastation, relief. The kind of relief that comes when you realize you almost walked into something that would have slowly erased you. Yes, I lost a fiancé. Yes, I endured whispers and speculation. Yes, I became the girl who called it off. But I didn't lose myself. That was the one thing they couldn't take. Looking back, I understand why their family felt perfect at first. Perfection isn't about love, it's about control. It's about making sure every piece fits exactly where it's supposed to. And I was never meant to be an equal piece. I was meant to fit quietly, but I chose not to. And sometimes, burning it all down is the only way to make sure you don't disappear inside someone else's idea of perfect.